रेडियो खांची 90.4 एफएम पर प्रसारित किए जाने वाले विषय वस्तु का सारा क्रेडिट प्रस्तुतकर्ता को दिया जाता है। हमारा मकसद है समाज में ज्ञान एवं सकारात्मकता को आगे बढ़ाना।
Dear students and friends, I, Dr. Sameera Sinha, Department of English, Jagannath Nagar College, Ranchi University, am on Radio Khanchi 90.4 FM, Hum Sabka Radio, and would like to present before you the Romantic Age in English literature in a new perspective. As you know, the Romantic Age commenced in 1798, the year William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge published a collection of their poems titled Lyrical Ballads. It set down the poetic practices and principles to be followed. As prepared by Wordsworth and Coleridge, it announced and demonstrated fundamental changes in both form and subject matter of English poetry. A major contribution to world literature since the Renaissance, the sterling phenomenon of 6 major poets appearing in just 2 generations comes within the ambit of the Romantic Age in English poetry. The Romantic Age saw the end of an older and more pastoral England. When William Blake was born in 1757, or even as late as 1770, when Wordsworth was born, England was still fundamentally an agricultural society. When William Blake died in 1827, England was largely an industrial nation. In 1850, when Wordsworth died, England was in every sense a subject for Marxist economic analysis in Das Kapital. The French Revolution, a social upheaval, is the most significant event, an external factor that determined the Romantic Age. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the storming of the Bastille evoked an enthusiastic response from English liberals and radicals alike, as did the clarion call of liberty, equality, and fraternity. In reaction to the formal, rational elements of 18th century verse, there emerged 5 writers who within a decade changed the very color and tenor of English poetry. Wordsworth's belief in the inspiration of nature, as is embodied in the prelude, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was fascinated by the supernatural phenomenon, which he does embody in his poems, The Ancient Mariner, Kubla Khan, and so on, are considered as the first generation romantics. The younger poets, Byron, Shelley, and Keats, who came next, had tragically short lives, but not so their art. They created some of the most beautiful and lyrical of English poems, revolutionizing ideas on beauty, truth, and imagination. The term Romanticism has often been used by literary historians as though it were the name for a single essence or quality shared in varying proportions by all principal writers of the Romantic period. But in this age, we may observe a certain sense of a release of energy, experimental boldness, and creative power as they strove for freedom and emphasis on imagination and emotion. While Walter Pater has defined Romanticism as strangeness added to beauty, a sense of wonder, according to Scott James, Romanticism means otherworldliness. Theodore Watt Dunton has called it a renaissance of wonder, and Abercrombie has called it a withdrawal from the outer experience and a concentration on the inner experience. Nevertheless, all attempts at a single definition of romanticism fall short of matching the variegated facts of a time which exceeds almost all other ages in English literature in the range and diversity of its achievement. Romanticism, in a sense, may be classified into 4 different categories. First, it is opposed to the commonplace, as it is imaginative, remote from experience, and visionary. Second, in contrast to the probable, it is fanciful and fantastic. Third, as opposed to the literal, it is mystic, symbolic, and unseen. And fourth, in contrast to the formal, it is grand, picturesque, passionate, and irregular. Based on these assumptions, one may say that the 4 main aesthetic characteristics of romantic poetry lies in emotion, imagination, vision, and mysticism. Let us take, for example, emotion. Wordsworth and Coleridge, in the lyrical ballads, declared that their poetry would deal with, first, humble and rustic life; second, everyday incidents and situations; third, emotions recollected in tranquility; and fourth, have a certain coloring of the imagination. Keats, in one of his letters, writes, and I quote, "Axioms of philosophy are no axioms unless and until they are felt upon the pulses." In other words, romantic poetry was to be experiential poetry, the personal experience of the poets and their thoughts and reactions and imagination were the feature largely in their poems of the Romantic age. Let us take the second aesthetic aspect, that is imagination. Imagination is another tenet of Romantic poetry, as described by Coleridge in chapter 13 of Biographia Literaria, and in his words, it is reality apprehended through the imagination, which he differentiates again into the primary and the secondary imagination. Primary imagination, he says, is the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. This is the primary realm of the Creator, while the secondary imagination, in his words, is that which dissolves, diffuses, and dissipates in order to recreate. This is the realm of the poet or the artist. I.A. Richards, in Coleridge on imagination, writes that imagination is subject, object, and coalescence. Kant believed that nature has a life of its own, but Coleridge is of the view that nature receives its life from the poet's mind. In Ode to Dejection, he writes, and I quote, "O lady, we receive, but what we give." In other words, Coleridge says that whatever the poet receives from nature, he gives back in enhanced and perhaps enlarged form, enhanced by the imagination of the poet. A very important concept that was given by Coleridge is of the esemplastic imagination, which is the secondary imagination. Esemplastic imagination has been taken from a Greek word, and it means unifying or joining as one. It shows growth and fantasy. In fixities and definites, there can be no growth. C.M. Baura writes in his book, The Romantic Imagination, that the Romantics were in quest of an unseen world, concerned with things of the spirit. William Blake has said, the world of imagination is the world of eternity. Vision is the next characteristic of Romantic poetry. Wordsworth, in Ode on Intimations of Immortality, writes of the poet as a prophet, a seer, the eye among the blind. He observed that in nature, every common sight was apparelled in celestial light. E.V. Lucas examines the romantic imagination and its ability to see into the nature of things from a psychological point of view. He differentiates between the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is the primitive consciousness, ego is the consciousness of the self, and superego is the divine consciousness. Romantic poetry had its share of criticism as well. Alluding to the limitations of Romantic poetry, Goethe writes, classicism is health, Romanticism disease. T.S. Eliot, in his essay The Functions of Criticism, differentiates between classical and Romantic poetry, and he asserts, the difference seems to me rather the difference between the complete and the fragmentary, the adult and the immature, the orderly and the chaotic. Edmund Wilson, in his book The Wound and the Bough, is of the opinion that the body affects the mind, that is, psychosomatic psychology. In his book, he has shown how Keats's poetry grew better as he suffered more through the hero that he has created, whose creative urge grows greater as his ulcer grows. However, T.S. Eliot repudiates this theory in his essay Traditions and Individual Talent, where he writes, and I quote, there is a distinction, a clear distinction, between the man who suffers and the man who creates. He further elaborates that poetry is not the turning loose of emotions. It is an escape from emotion. It is not the expression of personality. It is an escape from personality. With this, T.S. Eliot involved the theory of negative capability that Keats had first written about. Many of the major writers felt, however, that there was something distinctive about this age, a pervasive intellectual climate. This, we may call, is the spirit of the age. Thank you.